Good evening. I think most of you are aware, but I'm just going to remind you that there's an extra feathered friend amongst us, somewhere in the balcony. So just watch it if it comes flying through. But we've left an escape route for the pigeon to get out. So I'd like to introduce and welcome Charles Jolly, who's here this evening to talk to us about Arocha. If I said it right, it's close enough, yes. Charles was here back in February leading worship along with Alison, so welcome to Alison again. Thank you for coming. And hopefully we'll get more information about Arocha and also about Eco Church, we're hoping to. So I'm going to hand over to Charles. Thank you.
Good evening. Well, thank you for inviting me to join you on your eco journeys. Well, actually, you invited something from Arocha, but I turned up, but that's life, I'm afraid. That's what happens. An elderly Methodist lay preacher was asked how he planned his sermons. And he said, well, first I tell them what I'm going to tell them. Then I tell them what I've told them. So I'll start by telling you what I'm going to tell you. Arocha is a small organization, but one with a very big heart. And it aims to support all Christians in their journey to care for God's wonderful creation, which is still a relatively new idea for some of us who have been in the church for a long time. It's covered by what's known as the fifth mark of mission. It was the Anglican Church which originally drew up the 5 marks of mission, but many other churches, including the United Reformed, and I think the Methodists, have taken on the 5 marks of mission. But we sometimes forget that the 5th mark of mission was only added in 1990, which is when people first thought, well, hang on, we ought to include something about our mission as Christians to care for God's creation. So for those of us who, like me, who go back well beyond 1990, it's still a relative new idea that we're getting used to. It's actually in full to strive to safeguard the integrity of creation and to sustain and renew the life of the earth. And so Arocha sends out speakers to encourage people, to support people, but also to ask for support. And there are many ways that people can get involved. You can, of course, get your hands dirty, digging the ground and planting trees and looking after frogs and butterflies and that sort of thing. But also, you can support Arocha with prayer and, equally important, with money, with financial resources. Because everybody is finding it difficult to make ends meet these days, and Arocha is no different. It's actually had to cut down the number of staff that it has. It's moved to new premises, which I must say are nice ones, but it's had to streamline its work. And as speakers, we do need to point out that Arocha does need financial support as well as your prayers, and for those who feel called to do so, actually getting involved with some of the work. You see, like our magnificent but creaking NHS service, Arocha and all the resources are free at the point of use. So if a church wants to become an eco church, it simply signs up, and it's not charged any entrance fee or anything like that, because obviously we don't want anybody to be excluded on the grounds of saying, well, that's a bit expensive. But we do hope that churches which become eco-churches will also be able to support the charity financially, £25 a year, £50 a year, maybe £75 a year, which will help get more churches on board, will help to reduce the resources. And if people want to join individually, you'll find that I've put round 2 leaflets, well actually 3 because there's one about eco-church as well. But one leaflet with the picture of the kingfisher on it, which tells you briefly what Arocha is all about and gives you sort of a brief introduction to the different aspects of the charity, but also a leaflet called Support Our Work. And there are 2 aspects to this. I've mentioned the financial one for people who might feel that they would like to support financially, either with a one-off donation or maybe by setting up a standing order. But on the back of that leaflet, there's something that says, let's stay in touch. And that gives you a chance to tick whether you'd like, most of it does come out as emails actually, whether you'd like a monthly email about what's going on and the latest stories and information. There's also what's called Wild Christian. I like the idea of Wild Christians. And that's to support families in getting in, mainly for families, getting involved in ecologically friendly behaviour, maybe using their gardens or window boxes or whatever facilities they have, what they eat, how they can recycle and all that sort of thing. And then there's also a regular email update for churches, which is called Eco Church Connect. And also, if you aren't into emails, you can tick to receive postal news about Arocha. So don't feel excluded if you don't regularly use the internet. And then it's your name and address and postcode. Now, if you wanted to fill these in, and you can either fill in about donating, or you can fill in about information, or you can fill in both. It's an all-purpose leaflet that they've produced. You can fill it in and give it to me and I'll pass it on, or there's details for the address that you can take it away and send it off. And indeed, for the first 2 people, I found a couple of envelopes. So there are a couple of envelopes at the back that you could take and you could send it for free to Arocha. I think otherwise you have to put a stamp on it. So that's up to you, but we would be really, really pleased if you wanted to get involved in some way. And as I say, if you just want information, that's absolutely fine. But do it via this leaflet, please. As I say, either give it back to me or take it home and post it yourself. So I'm going to be talking about the work of Arocha, and let's have a quick look at a video that they've produced, which kind of outlines the different aspects of the work that they do. So if we can project that now. The first point is it is a Christian charity. It's the only one of its sort in the United Kingdom, and it's specifically about helping people to work to protect and restore the natural world. In other words, everything that we see that's living around us. And it's therefore about equipping churches to care for the environment and, as you know, the biggest part of this is actually the Eco-Church programme. But it's about us all as a community working together. As we said, Eco-Church is about learning as churches to care for nature, resourcing environmental leaders, preachers, so that they can actually preach sermons about it. And then there are nature reserves. There are two, which I'll mention later, to show what can be done. One of them is Wolf Fields. Unfortunately, both of these are very much in the south of the country, which was once used for drug dealing and is now a wonderful area of wildflowers and animals. And there's another one as well, which is Fox Earth Meadows Nature Reserve. As it says, it's between Suffolk and Essex. And this is a wetland habitat. This is particularly good for dragonflies and damselflies. And there's a lot of research actually done as well in relation with what's called Partners in Action. And this is, I think, nearly 30 different organisations across the country which have lots of land and can actually develop this land in an environmentally friendly way. It also mentions that actually we are only part of, I think, 20 countries which have Arocha programs. So there's Arocha International, but if you're looking it up on the internet, do look up Arocha UK. Otherwise you may get one of the different ones and wonder what it was all about. So that's just a quick overview of what Arocha does. Now, the fact that you've come along this evening obviously means that you're taking the ecological crisis seriously. But I'll just try and indicate how Arocha fits in. And the problem is that we are faced by two environmental crises at once. One of them is incredibly urgent, and the other one is desperately important. Well, the urgent one, of course, is climate change caused by global warming. And avoiding climate catastrophe is now top of the agenda. Well, it should be top of the agenda for all politicians, but it's certainly top of the agenda for people who care about nature and the globe. What needs to be done to prevent a huge amount of suffering, of course, is to cut our carbon emissions very quickly indeed. We've got to do this within the next few years. It is really, really desperate in terms of the time that's available. And you may know that a lot of churches are trying to get to zero emissions for their church by 2030. That is a huge ask. But at least if we're aiming at it, we are clear what the problem is and that we have got to try and act and persuade our politicians to act very urgently. So if you had a chance to get along to hustings in the next few months, that's the sort of question that you should be asking. The second, let's have a quick sip of water. The second crisis is the one I'm talking about this evening. And if anything, it's more important because much of nature is in danger of collapsing. And one illustration of this that struck me very forcibly and possibly resonates with you is that when I was young, my father used to take the family out in the car in the summer, and we had to stop every 2 miles to clean the remains of insects off the windscreen. Does anybody remember that? You don't do that now, do you? In fact, if you get the odd insect splodging on the windscreen, it's quite unusual. What that means is there's been a huge collapse in the number of insects. Now think of the creatures that feed on insects: bats, birds, frogs, So their numbers are collapsing as well. And the insects is just an example. Across the planet, and certainly across this country, the numbers of many creatures has been simply collapsing. And, the sort of numbers are shocking. It's dropped by 60, 70, 80% or more for many of these creatures. Why has this happened? Well, there are three reasons. Anybody ever go into a garden centre? Have you ever looked at the shelves with rows of insecticides and pesticides and herbicides? That's one reason why the numbers are dropping. We've been poisoning them, and I'm afraid we're still poisoning them in many cases. So one thing that we can do is to try and not use such nasty chemicals ourselves and to discourage other people, because they're not really necessary. There are alternative ways of controlling pests, but you need a bit of knowledge, for people, particularly for farmers and horticulturists. But certainly in our gardens, we don't need to use these things at all. The other big problem is loss of habitat. I think since the Second World War, we've lost 97%, that's nearly all of our wildflower meadows. We've lost huge numbers of hedges, so we've lost the places where insects and other wild creatures can live. And so one of the things that Arocha is doing in its nature reserves and with its partners for action is providing wild animals, wild insects, these little creatures mainly, with habitats where they can live, places which they will find hospitable, where they can breed and increase their numbers. And the same goes for freshwater habitats, so that we can increase the number of dragonflies and mayflies and insects like that. So habitat, and of course the third thing is climate change, which is making life even more difficult for many creatures. Temperatures are different from what they expect. Birds think, well, it must be time to get nesting. So they start nesting and lay their eggs and hatch little babies, but the caterpillars aren't around as they always used to be, because they're working on a different time scale. The whole thing is upset. And so climate change is also causing, not at the moment the most serious, but if it gets much hotter, it may well be the most serious. So Arocha also is trying to help people to do whatever we can to stop global warming from taking place. And of course, if you look wider afield, there are some very bad things going on. Fish stocks in many oceans have very nearly collapsed. And there's something that I can only think was designed in hell, which is called bottom trawling, where great big ships drag trawls along the bottom, scooping up everything there, effectively wrecking the habitat, and then selecting the ones that they think we can eat and throwing the others over, well, they might or might not recover. This is having a terrible effect, but of course, out of sight, out of mind. So we need to learn to take care of creation in what we do individually, but also in what we do politically and in terms of campaigning. Soil. Now, people look at the ground and they think, well, that's just dirt. A healthy soil is full of billions of tiny creatures which actually break down and produce nutrients for the plants that are growing. But that's a healthy soil. And too many of our soils have been, what with all the herbicides and too much fertilizers and the sort of treatment they get, they're becoming dead. And as time goes on, unless we can restore the soil, we're going to have problems growing food in the future. So we've got to work with nature instead of working against nature. And we've got to see nature as our friend and not our enemy that somehow has to be defeated to grow the plants that we need for our food. The most important thing that Arocha has done is setting up eco-church. Now, the aim was that there would be 10% of churches in the United Kingdom would be signed up by 2025. They actually met that target in 2021, and the numbers have kept on increasing very rapidly. And a lot of these churches have now got the Bronze Award, like yourselves here, and are busy working on the Silver Award. And the thing I really like about Eco Church is it's broken down into little bits that you can do. So you don't have to think, goodness me, what on earth are we going to do? You can look at sort of one issue at a time and see how you're doing, and then whether you're able to actually improve on that one. And then you put all your answers to the questionnaire into the survey, and up pops how you're doing in terms of bronze or silver or gold. And if you can get to bronze in every one of the 5 categories, then you're awarded a bronze, ditto for silver. If you think you've got to gold, they'll actually come along and look at you and see how you're doing and actually talk about it. So whereas you can get a bronze and a silver by what's sort of called self-assessment, you simply fill it in. If you're wanting a gold, somebody's actually going to come along and inspect you and make sure you're actually doing all the things that you think you're doing right. And then there's Wild Christian, which, as I mentioned, is for families. And that's really good because you get sort of tips and ideas produced. And as I say, it really is by email, but focusing particularly on, families with young children who are learning to look after nature properly. And then there are the reserves, the nature reserves, which are often pretty rubbishy places to begin with, which have been recovered and turned into places which are not only good for animals, but good for people. Because one of the things that's been found that we need for our mental health is to have contact with nature, particularly in peaceful places. And the reserves provide that. Of course, they provide places for children to run around with nets, seeing how many bugs they can catch and that sort of thing as well. In fact, I think if I was a bug, I'd keep well clear of an Arocha reserve. But there we are. Sadly, the 2 reserves which you just mentioned there in the video are way down in the south of England. But Arocha has been partnering with a number of different Christian organisations, places like conference centres, which have big grounds, that sort of thing, so that they also can be places which are very friendly to nature and where people can go along and have a look and be inspired and get ideas and that sort of thing. The last count, I think there were 27 of these, and the aim is to get 50. Sadly, there's not one near here. But if you felt inspired, you might be able to get involved in setting one up. And I mention that to every church I go to, because maybe at some stage we could get together and see if we couldn't do something locally. Because, of course, these aren't just for the church people. They're for anybody to go along and to see what can be done. The other worry is that it's not just the numbers of species, not just the number of flies and butterflies and all the rest of it that are dropping. Species are actually going extinct. So particular creatures are disappearing for good. Not just their numbers are getting small, but they're disappearing. And this is something that's really worrying, because we should be able to do something about it if we can provide habitats. Hedgehogs is one well-known example. Frogs, particularly badly threatened, and certainly several types of frogs have disappeared completely for now. And the scientists tell us that the extinction rate at the moment is nearly 1,000 times what you would expect naturally. You know, obviously new creatures come along and old ones eventually die out. But that's a very slow process. It's getting on for 1,000 times faster, and that spells trouble. So what Arocha has done is to pick 25 targets to support to try and get improvement across the country. Some of these are things like upland grass meadows, to restore those, but there are also many animals and birds and butterflies which are particularly threatened, that they are encouraging people to take particularly good care of and to produce places where these creatures can live. And to be honest, we have made some big strides recently, thanks to organisations like Arocha. And we don't always celebrate it, but actually for people, poor people in this world, conditions are much better than they used to be. And this is thanks to Tear Fund and Christian Aid and Oxfam and many other organisations. And of course, governments and scientists and environmentalists and doctors. And child mortality has absolutely plummeted across the world. You only have to go back to around after the Second World War, and your chances of surviving past childhood were very low, perhaps 50% at best. Now, child mortality is relatively much lower than it was. And because of this, many women, particularly in poor countries, are happy to have smaller families because they don't think they need lots of children to support them in their old age. And also, the conditions of many women, I'm glad to say, has improved, and they have control over the number of children they have. So family size has absolutely plummeted. And in fact, many countries are now worried that they're going to have enough babies to support us in our old age, because family size has dropped so much. So whereas a few years ago, people were desperately worried about whether the world would have too many people to support, it's now beginning to worry, governments, particularly in rich countries, are beginning to worry about whether there are going to be enough people. It's a complete turnaround. But that just shows how much conditions for people have improved. But the trouble is, while we've been improving all the conditions for people, we haven't given the same sort of attention to looking after other species. And that's what we're now trying to catch up with, and what we're having to work on with organisations like Arocha. Now, the idea was that we would pause at this stage and see if anybody had any questions. I can carry on. Look, I used to teach physics, A-level physics. And A-level physics, you normally teach in 2-hour lessons. So I'm quite happy to carry on for 2 hours. But I'll stop there and say, does anybody have any questions they'd like to ask about the work of Arocha?
I'm very interested. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, and I'll repeat the question.
I'm very interested in what you've been saying about Arocha. And it strikes me that we're on the brink of going beyond awareness raising into what is it practical, at a practical business, churches specifically could do. Would they be better to be working as groups of churches rather than competing at a local level, one church against another, but all of them eco-friendly? And there's also an issue of, if you cannot do everything for everyone, you should do one thing and do it really well. And it might be a case that individual churches might choose one aspect rather than a global aspect of climate change prevention.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so that's about churches working together and maybe specialising in particular areas of caring for nature. And I think you're right. But it is important that the churches in an area, like, churches together or something like that, do work together on this. But I would say that eco-church was for everybody, but within the eco-church, certainly, you might like to concentrate on particular areas. I mean, if you're a church which hasn't got any land, and a lot of United Reformed churches don't, you're not going to be able to do a great deal locally with your land. On the other hand, if you are an Anglican church with a really big churchyard, then there's loads of things that you can do, like making that more friendly for insects and birds and bugs generally, and planting trees, planting plants which are trying to restore something like a wildflower meadow maybe in the churchyard. So it is what we've got available to us. And maybe a church in the middle of a city is going to be able to work with people locally in terms of what you can do in a city. It might only be growing plants on in flower pots on a terrace or something like that. But everything that we can do is going to help. But I think you're right. Don't attempt too much all at once. And again, I think that's one of the things that does come over from Eco Church. Do things, improve things one at a time. But all these issues have got to be dealt with by all of us. So we've all got to be insect friendly. It's no good saying, oh, well, that church can carry on using herbicides because we won't. There's certain things that we've all got to do. And we've all got to cut down on plastics. So maybe it's more a matter of individual churches taking a lead and showing what can be done and then helping others, rather than trying to take a lead on lots of things at once. So I think I'd agree with you there, yes. And any other questions or points anybody would like to ask? I mean, you can come up here with, if you like.
Got a louder voice, you're all right. When you were saying about focusing on particular species Arocha are doing, what species have there been? With our church garden, we've got pollinator pots, so we're doing small little bits of pollinator pots. So we focus on ladybirds, so we've got quite a lot of ladybirds.
Yes.
Mainly, we do have 7 spotted ones, not the harlequin ones. So there's lots of.
Wonderful.
So we do have species that are sort of not invasive to Britain, but more natural to Britain. And we're focused on things. But I know I was reading on the website of the Arocha website that they were doing projects in some of the on the 2 bits, the wetland one, about the fritillary, like the little meadow big butterfly.
Yes.
The one that's really, really extinct. So it needs really wild grasslands in land that isn't looked after. So I know they were doing that, but I wasn't sure if there's any other ones that we could focus on that as a church.
I'm just turning to the notes I have. Target groups, native wildflowers, farmland and garden birds, because the numbers of those have dropped. Corn bunting, yellowhammer, skylark, turtle dove, and so particularly the partners are concentrating on producing habitats that will be beneficial for those. dragonflies and damselflies we've mentioned, because they're particularly badly hit by climate change and pollution, apparently, has hit them particularly bad. And of course, butterflies. It says here that of the 57 species, 22 are regularly recorded in urban gardens. So there again, that's something, you know, even if you live in a town, that you can do to attract. If you think of the number of gardens, I think it's something like 22 million gardens in this country. Think what sort of area that must add up to altogether. And the benefit that we could produce, if you imagine everybody turned their garden into an insect sanctuary and a bird sanctuary, what a huge impact that would have, even if nobody else got involved. And a lot of those are in towns. So there is a huge amount that we can do. And it's just a matter really of getting to know what is going to be most helpful. And this is where Arocha comes in, particularly with its regular publications that it produces, you know, to show people what they can actually do positively, you know, and sort of turn good intentions into practical results. Like it sounds that you're doing rather well. So.
Yeah, we do that. Well, I do look at that anyway. We don't use any pesticides. Everything's organic.
That's absolutely vital, yes.
And most, where I can, I use sort of homemade compost from my urban backyard at home in the pots. So as a church, we're getting involved with Messy Church, and obviously nearly everybody in the church is having input into a little urban garden. We've got some really lovely species of insects especially. I'm very fond of the odd bug hunt.
So hopefully you're encouraging other churches to do the same. Because this is one really important thing about getting together, is that we can encourage each other. You know, have you found, you know, a way of getting recycling your soft plastics, which I discovered the other day. Tesco collects them. So all your bread bags or anything like this, which you can't avoid, at least you don't have to put them in the rubbish any longer. You can take them along to be recycled. You know, so all these things that we pick up, we can pass on, which is really helpful. And in terms of habitats, grasslands apparently are very important. Hedgerows are essential for a whole range of different creatures. Freshwater habitats, we mentioned, making sure that the water is really pure, and so, you know, it encourages all little creatures. It was very sad. We used to have a field, and there was a stream running through it, and it had all sorts of little creatures in it, like freshwater shrimps. And then, over the years, they died off, and we found the reason was that the farmers were using far too much nitrates, which were getting into the streams and killed all the creatures. Now that's the sort of thing we need to reverse, and try to stop happening. And so certainly with Arocha, you have champions here. Incidentally, the magazine they produce, Root and Branch, is really good, and it's only twice a year. And if you donate, and if you donate £25 or more a year, you get these sent to you automatically. So just a thought. I mean, it might be worth, if somebody in the church is getting these, it's really good to pass them around, or, you know, put them somewhere where people can have a look, because they do have really interesting articles and lots of tips, and get you up to date with what is happening and what can be done. Any more questions or points anybody would make to make?
Yes, I think one area of Eco Church that is worrying for this church is that we are in an old building.
Yes.
And in order to do any work, you have to go through certain stages to get it done. So,
Are you're listed?
Yes.
Yes.
So things like a double glazing glazing and cavity wall and solar panels, they're always going to be a stumbling block for the church.
Yeah.
And you can't achieve silver unless you're silver in each of the 5 areas.
Yes.
So although we can do our very best in all the other areas, we struggle with that building area.
It is a problem. I think that some authorities are beginning to become a little bit more sympathetic, and they're going to have to, because climate change is such a big problem.
Yes.
Everything has to be done, and I'm afraid that will have to take priority over listed buildings. So it's partly a matter of applying and keeping up pressure and talking to local politicians as well as to MPs, and trying to get them to understand that while obviously if it's a listed building you want to be sympathetic, you do have to have things like secondary glazing. And if you can put up solar panels that aren't too obtrusive, and I mean I've known several churches which have fought for years, and they've finally got permission when they've worked out a way of getting these solar panels so that they aren't visible from the ground. And you think, well, the whole point is you want them to be visible, because you want them to see people to see that you're doing something to try and cut your carbon. The attitude has to change, and I'm sorry, it is a problem in the meantime. But if it becomes a stimulus to get involved politically and to try and get people to understand that it's not simply that it would be nice for you to get a silver award, but actually it's essential if we're going to. And you see, it's not just what we do, it's about changing the whole attitude, which we've got to do very quickly, so that people are actually prepared to make the sacrifices that are going to be needed. And basically, people will protect what they love. So one of the main aims of Arocha is to allow people to get out there into nature and learn to love nature and these little creatures. I mean, obviously we should love them because God treasures them. And if we say we love God, we can't really trash the wonderful world that God has made. But it's a matter of getting our emotions involved. So we actually do really care about what's happening to all these other species, and what's happening to the soil and what's happening to the oceans. Because when we really care, then we're going to stand up and start shouting about it and making a fuss. And we're not going to let governments and big companies get away with things. So you see the work that Arocha is doing is really fundamental. Because if we are, as churches, going to have the sort of influence we need to have, we've really got to care about what's happening. And we will really care when we get involved, and sort of actually feel, hang on, these creatures are part of our family. We all belong together. We're not going to let these big companies harm them. We're not going to let governments get away with not spending the money that has to be spent on improving the environment. We're going to insist on it. So it all kind of is a whole and works together. So on the one hand, I'm really sorry about your building the Silver Award. On the other hand, if it's a stimulus to get involved and to explain to the people who make these rules why it is important that you can do some of these things to improve the building, in the end, probably good will come out of it. I mean, that's what Paul says, isn't it? God works all things together for good. So I'm sorry your silver may be a bit delayed, but keep working on it. Yeah. So, how much longer do you want me to go on? As I say, I could keep on going for 2 hours if you want me to. We've been going for 3/4 of an hour.
So maybe we could adjourn for refreshments, but we can continue talking over tea and coffee. Would that be okay? Yeah, we'll do that.
Right.
So
Thank you.
very much, Charles. Thank you.
No, well, thank you for coming along, because That's the important thing, and hopefully it'll encourage you and reinforce you in what you're doing, and get out there, and maybe next time we have a talk like this, we'll get just a few more people along.
Can I just say one more thing? I was thinking, it's not my viewpoint at all, but what I have heard when I've been listening is that we'll do all this recycling, we'll do our own little bit over here, but maybe in another part of the world, they're polluting the oceans and
Yes.
plastic. And some people may then say, why should I bother? I mean, I don't say that at all, but I have heard that viewpoint.
Well, there's several points to be made here. One is that the world is very much divided into rich and poor, and we're the rich. And one of the reasons why we're rich is that we take lots of resources from poor countries, so they don't have the facilities that they might otherwise have for recycling and for that sort of thing. So that's one point. Another point is we actually send a lot of our rubbish to poor countries to deal with. So we're not in any position to then grumble at them for not looking after it well. And we need, as rich countries, to provide poor countries with the resources to be able to cope with these problems. So one of the things that I'm not happy about is when we say, well, you know, we'll set an example. It's easy for us to set an example. We've got to help poorer people to actually deal with these problems, because we're the ones, to some extent, who are actually making the problems worse for them to deal with. Yeah. Yes, it's difficult not to become a bit political when you get into into these issues. But as I say, the heart of it is really caring for God's wonderful creation and learning to love it. And, well, I mean, parents love their children and they'll fight tooth and nail for their children, won't they? And it should be like that with nature. You know, in a sense, we're all part of this network of life. And we've got to really care for it and be prepared, when necessary, to fight tooth and nail. Thank you very much. So we can retire through for a cup of tea.